So again, tonight's webinar, as you know, because you registered, is about intersectional justice, why LGBTQIA plus and racial justice can't be siloed. This is all about baptismal promises to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Because queer and transphobia and racism are interrelated systems of oppression that require an equally interrelated resistance. So tonight, you're going to receive a reminder of our baptismal promises, a brief overview of the histories of trauma, and some practical thoughts about advocacy and change moving forward. It is my honor and joy to introduce our leader tonight, the Reverend Dana Newhouser. Dana is an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church. She likes to think of a deacon as shorthand for justice-seeking, peace-making, disciple-equipping followers of Jesus. She has a heart for racial, LGBTQIA+, and environmental justice, and seeks to invite and equip others to work for justice in the world as part of faithful living. She is the Minister of Public Witness for New City Church in Minneapolis, and Dana also serves on the board of directors of the Minnesota Council of Churches and on the steering team of MARCH, which stands for Multi-Faith, Anti-Racism Change, and Healing Coalition. Dana, thank you for leading us tonight. We are now in your hands.
I really need to write a shorter bio. Wow. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for setting aside this time on a Thursday evening to be together in this blessed and sometimes complicated space via technology, but I'm so grateful that we have this chance to be together, even if it's virtual. Why don't we take a moment to be in a posture of prayer? God of multitude, call us to love the diversity we represent as we reflect your likeness. Stir in us a deep discontent and restlessness for calls of unity that seek to suppress each one's unique voice, body, experience, and expression of belovedness. Embolden us into spaces where each of these expressions are seen, valued, restored, and where we are reminded that all you created is good. Amen. Before we get started in earnest, I'm going to just say a word about words. The language that we use, especially around race and sexuality, is often changing, and people tend to can get a little stuck when they don't know the right words. And I'll just admit, I don't always have the right words, but I'm trying to define some things so that we have shared understanding and can work from there. So even in the title, you heard LGBTQIA+, and that, of course, stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual. And the plus indicates that there's a bigger diversity of sexual orientation, of expression, and identity that extends beyond what can be captured in an acronym. You will hear me alternate between LGBTQIA+ and defaulting to the umbrella term queer. And that's really just meant, again, as an umbrella term that includes and indicates all variety of orientation, expression, and identity that falls outside of a cis hetero framework. And I do want to acknowledge that for some of us who are a little bit older, that language is actually really stressful because it was used in my, growing up formative years as a slur. But it's language that has been reclaimed and it's being used and embraced by community. And I'm trying to take my cue from my community that I'm most deeply in relationship with, and that means learning to be comfortable with the use of queer as an umbrella term. And finally, not finally, but the last one I'll lift up is BIPOC. You'll hear me say BIPOC, and that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And this is, again, not without its controversy. All these language pieces are evolving and changing over time, but because Black and Indigenous people in the U.S. have and continue to experience a particular kind of violence, cultural genocide, and oppression, we lift out Black and Indigenous from the umbrella term people of color, to acknowledge that there is a different texture of that history and ongoing oppression. It's not oppression Olympics. We're not like pitting people against each other, but we just want to name with a little bit more specificity. But it also like can BIPOC, when it's overused, can flatten out and kind of obscure the particularities. So it's my practice, and I think it's considered best practice, if at all possible, when you're referring to people, to be as specific as possible, right? So to name Black people, to name, Asian American, or even better yet, I am Okinawan American, like to name with as much specificity as you can in describing people or groups. But when you use an umbrella term, just acknowledge that that's like trying to encapsulate something beyond the individual, okay? So just for an example of usage, I would say Black women in the United States experience unacceptably poor maternal health outcomes, including disproportionately high rates of death related to pregnancy or childbirth. I would not say BIPOC women in the United States, because I want to disaggregate the particular experience of Black women, okay? So that's just, you'll hear me kind of switch around the language, and I just want to be able to be as clear as possible about why I'm using those terms. And again, all of the terms that I just tried to define are evolving over time, and there can be some stress about its usage. So you don't have to feel like you always have to get it exactly right, but also being in relationship with communities that you can take the feedback, like when a different term is called for, or something more specific is called for, that you're able to like receive that and move on. So that's it's just a little bit of context setting. So I'm not able to see everybody who's on the call easily, but the people that I do see, I know that many of you were at the Minnesota Annual Conference of 2019. I actually see Carol Zagsma is here, and we're going to be talking about some stuff that Carol did. But if you recall, way back then, it's been not quite 4 years, friends, and it feels like about a decade and a half, because time has been really weird through the pandemic, but here we are. If you go back to the Minnesota Annual Conference of 2019, that was a time coming out of the devastation of the February General Conference, the special General Conference, in which the General Conference voted to double down on policies of exclusion, right? So excluding LGBTQIA clergy from ordination, and taking even further punitive measures against any clergy who perform same-sex weddings. So where we thought there might be some breaking open of the exclusionary language and policies in the Book of Discipline, it got doubled down on. And for many of us, that was a heartbreaking and gut-wrenching time. And coming into annual conference, there was a concerted effort to say, not here, not in Minnesota. That's not who we are. We're going to operate differently. So out of the shock and grief, Minnesota Methodists, a grassroots movement of clergy and laity, came together to try to set a new course, a more inclusive course for Minnesota. So at that time, Minnesota Methodists brought 2 pieces of legislation forward. And Carol, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was mainly the 2. The inclusive vision was one, and a resolution that actively stated a rejection of the traditional plan, which was what was passed at General Conference. So these were formal steps in saying, we want to be something We aspire to be more inclusive, and we will not abide by the harm of the traditional plan. So all of this was like super powerful and really exciting. And it's, of course, not going to work for me. Just a second. Why is technology like this? Oh, it was going so well. Okay. We can do this. We can do hard things. I believe in us and technology.
Whoops.
Okay, here we are. So Minnesota Annual Conference 2019 was this powerful engagement around inclusion. We engaged in respectful conversations around inclusion. We sat at tables, shared these heartfelt and honest and vulnerable responses to some questions. We listened. We practiced listening with a posture of empathy rather than judgment. We engaged in holy conferencing rather than debate about the inclusive vision. We heard from youth saying that they were not they wouldn't join their church at confirmation because of the harm of exclusion. We heard from lay members who'd found grace and belonging in queer affirming congregations. We heard from clergy who stood in solidarity with their clergy peers who still find it safer in the closet because the church still says in the Book of Discipline that their identity is incompatible with Christian teaching. Elsewhere during annual conference, we heard profoundly moving testimonies from current and retired clergy who had been harmed by the UMC policies. And the whole thing was a powerful experience of trying to envision and to embody and to set a course towards something more inclusive, more just in Minnesota. Now, if you'll imagine with me a little bit of that sound that a record makes when, you'd stop it abruptly. Then we had siblings, BIPOC clergy siblings, who looked around during this whole experience and said, that's great, but why are we talking so much about queer inclusion when y'all still have a lot of work to do on racial justice? That, of course, is my paraphrase of what the group said. And the thing is, racial justice is worked in through the Book of Discipline. The Book of Discipline has all the right words, all the pretty words. But we're not always good at living out those commitments in our churches, in our systems, in our clergy support. And so this group that would become known as Minnesota Mosaics came together, and they were granted a point of personal privilege by the bishop. And they read a statement that started by saying, quote, "The Minnesota Annual Conference made huge strides toward being the inclusive church yesterday. However, the Minnesota Annual Conference needs to respond passionately to marginalized ethnic groups. We acknowledge that we should put our constant effort to remove systemic racism within the Minnesota Annual Conference and its member churches." End quote. And that statement continued to name some specific actions that this group of BIPOC clergy were calling the annual conference to take in the next few years. So they named some specifics around becoming more racially just and becoming more culturally competent. So in that moment, there could have been a sense of either or, queer inclusion versus racial justice. And it felt like we're pitting communities against each other. But to that, many of us said, ¿por qué no los dos? Why not both? Right? How can we do both racial justice and queer inclusion so that we're building the beloved community that is inclusive and celebratory of all people? So if you don't know this flag, you you've probably seen it around. It's a more recent iteration of the pride flag, and it's called the Progress Pride flag. Oh, okay. Let's try again. Nope, just a second. Zoom is so great when it's working right. Yay. Okay, I forget who said that they could only see half the screen. Is that still true?
Right now we're seeing a loading screen.
A loading screen, okay.
Yep.
You want to let me know if it stops loading and actually is visible?
That.
Wow.
We were able to see, Dana, all of the typical page before you go into slideshow mode.
Uh-huh. Shoot. Okay, let's try. Okay. Sorry.
This never happens at any of our churches, right?
Never.
No one's ever.
No one's ever had trouble with this before.
You could try to just not go into slideshow mode, and I think we'd be able to see it just fine.
Okay. Well, we'll try that. But then you have to see all the tabs that I have open, and I actually not.
Though the meeting's recorded, let's all promise that we will hold in covenant and confidentiality all of Dana's tabs.
I actually closed
Dana,
most, so it's okay.
If you drag the tab, you can pull it into its own window. And then nobody has to see anything.
Here. What about now? Can you?
That's a smaller version than the previous one.
So I think we'll just go with this for now. The other thing that I can do is share the slideshow after. So if everybody who's registered, you'll get the recording and you'll get a copy of the slides so that you can actually read them if it's troublesome to read on the screen right now. So this is the Progress Pride flag. It's a newer iteration of the Pride flag because it added these, this artist.
Dana,
Yeah.
I don't think you're sharing the screen you think you are.
Oh.
What we see is a tiny little suggested intersectional justice.
Okay. Okay.
Saw your Google Drive folder.
Cool. Those are a mess. I'm sorry that you saw that. I'm going to try one more time, and then I'm going to just, we're going to move on without slides because it'll be okay. But I'm going to give it one more try.
You put a lot of effort into those slides. I want to see
That'll
that.
work.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, so don't change anything.
Okay. So I have to advance the slide. I'm not going to touch it. So this new version of the Pride flag, the Progress Pride flag, is by a Portland-based designer named Daniel Kassar. And what you'll notice is the hoist on the side. So they're new stripes. So it's not adding the horizontal stripes to the rainbow, but it's adding the part on the left side that indicates both like the importance of naming people of color as part of the queer community, and also specifically using the trans colors, the white, pink, and blue, to be specific about trans inclusion as well. And this is all of this when we're talking about intersectional justice, when we're talking about racial justice and queer inclusion, it's not just this idea of like both and, in the same way that you want to walk and chew gum at the same time, like they're two distinctive things, but you're going to try to do them at the same time. The thing to remember is that the core of these oppressive systems are the same. They're seeking to dehumanize, to delegitimize, and to disempower people based on identity. So I'm going to name specifically a couple of key assumptions that I'm coming to this work with, and I'm hoping that we share. The first key assumption is that we are all beloved children of God, made in God's image, that we are reflective of the Imago Dei, the image of God, okay? And the second assumption is that we're called to the work of inclusion and justice through our baptismal promises. So I'm just gonna hope that many of you know what I'm talking about here, but just to be clear, I'm gonna remind us of this key section in our baptismal liturgy. Do you renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, reject the evil powers of this world, and repent of your sin? And all God's people say, I do. Do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? We do. Do you confess Jesus Christ as your Savior, put your whole trust in his grace, and promise to serve him as your Lord, in union with the church which Christ has opened to people of all ages, nations, and races? I do. So in this series of questions, what we're doing as community is we're confessing our complicity in the sin of oppression, and we're actively repenting of that sin. We're also promising as community to dismantle oppression in whatever form it takes. So this is something beyond the individual. This is something that looks to the community and to the system. So what we're doing is dismantling oppression that lives in systems and in ourselves. And finally, it's reminding us that we do all of this in, through, and supported by Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, the one who calls us to draw the circle wide. So I'm going to invite you all to just take a minute or two, I'll set a timer, to just reflect on what we've remembered together so far in our Minnesota story and our Christian Methodist story of our baptisms, and just take a couple minutes. You can use this time to write down any questions that you have, and or write down any reflections that you have. And if you have questions, like Kirkland said already, you can type them in the chat. Those will be collated and shared during the Q&A section later. I'm cutting your time short a little bit because I'm conscious of our time together. So I don't mean to rush you. I'm sorry, but I hope you continue to jot down whatever comes up for you as I continue. But one of the things, for some of you who have taken Building Beloved Community, the anti-racism training that the conference has offered the last couple of years, particularly for clergy, this will look familiar. But one of the things that we need to balance in this work of justice is staying rooted in our baptismal covenant and the reminder that we're all beloved and that we share in that belovedness. But we also have to hold the reality that the world has messages and like systems that say otherwise about whole groups of people. So, and many of that those oppressive systems are related to various social identities. So this wheel that you see on the screen, I'm sorry it's so small, but I don't want to mess with it, identifies just different identity categories. So race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, ability/disability, first language, age, and religious affiliation. So these are all different ways that we identify individually and find meaning in groups. But each of the, and so, I mean, we all carry different combinations of these various identities, which is really cool, right? Like that's part of the great diversity of God's creation. That's awesome. And the reality is that oppression equals prejudice plus power. So based on these social identities, there are some groups that are not just experience prejudice, but because of the power differential, experience oppression. So let me see if an illustration will help make this a little bit clearer. So you can see on this slide, this is not mine, because I am not Norwegian, but this person, their ethnicity is Norwegian and German. They're middle class, cis female, they're heterosexual, they're US born, they're able-bodied, they speak English as a first language, they're 33, they're Christian and Methodist, and they're identify as white. And so this is all really, this is really about like self-identity. But then when you use a lens about power, you start to see that some of this gets differentiated a little bit. So as a white person, her experience is that whiteness gives her access to social power, right? Same thing with being Christian in the US. That is a power position rather than a targeted position. But you can see, like with gender over on the side. So she's cisgendered. So her gender matches the gender assigned at birth, but she's a woman. So like you can still experience some power differential and being targeted by the system, because the system has historically been most built for cis white men, right? And Christian and all the other things, educated, higher socioeconomic status. So this exercise, when we do it, is you're supposed to color in solid in the box if it's an identity that gives you access to power, and do the little hash lines if it's something that makes you a targeted identity. And of course, it's not as clear cut as our little coloring sheet would make it seem. This is a little bit more nuanced in that, there are kind of gradations in the access to power, and also recognizing that that some of this is contextual. So people's access to power and their identity's access to power is often in relation to their context. You will, if you take a minute to think about what power, well, let me take a minute to say to you what I'm thinking of when I use the word power. So power can mean access to resources. It can mean the ability to influence a system, an institution, a family system. It also can be part of access to decision makers. And then this is a big one, the ability to define reality for yourself. So it's really about the ability to name what is normal and what is not. And so people who have more access to power can name what is normal and thus exclude those that they deem as abnormal or outside of that line. And all of this, like I said, it's relative. So even if you take citizenship, right, as a category, so there are people who are, born citizens in the US. There are some people who've immigrated and have documentation, and there's some people who are undocumented. And so there's a relationship to the center of power based on that line. And then it gets a little more tricky because you add in language and country of origin and race. So you start to see how a British white person who comes to the US may have more access to social power than a Spanish-speaking Guatemalan who comes to the US. And that's even before you get into documentation status, right? Just the overlay of race and language starts to complicate some of that. And you think about all of this is normalized within our institutions. So think about your churches as a place where that advantaged or disadvantaged identities can actually play out. And so some people coming into your congregations, into your congregational settings, are going to experience that setting with more or less pressure based on their mix of social identities and how the context is built for or not for those particular identities, language, race, sexual orientation. And you can imagine in church contexts, in this moment, you have to be extremely clear and extremely intentional about the desire to be inclusive of of all sexual orientations and expressions, because the default assumption is that churches aren't inclusive, right? So part of it is just the community or the culture of the place, and then being able to communicate as explicitly as possible that this is something that we are working to build a more inclusive place, and know that people are coming in testing the waters. It's not going to be just everything's easy peasy, lemon squeezy. I'm going to come into your church, and because you have that great rainbow flag, I know everything's going to be fine. People are coming in with some just lived experience that tells them caution, right? So we get back to this question of pitting groups against each other. We can see that systems of oppression are kind of variations on a theme. But then we get stuck in this cycle of fighting for scraps, right? So we have, we're fighting for racial justice, And then people are going, but what about LGBTQIA inclusion? Okay, so we're working on LGBTQIA inclusion, like, oh, but what about racial justice? And then instead of thinking, okay, but we're actually like, those systems of harm are playing from the same playbook. So how do we figure out how to join forces in a way that like moves us forward? So if you think about the ways that like especially the church has been known to weaponize scripture to justify oppression, like we think of those clobber passages. Well, you know, you might not be, it might not come to mind immediately, but there were similar clobber passages around race, right? So arguments for segregation in particular were justified by scripture. So Genesis 11:8, the Tower of Babel, like this is like in my lifetime, my grandma said to me, God created races to keep people separate. Never mind that I'm the product of a multiracial marriage. Never mind that. But so this is like active harm, using scripture to justify racial segregation. And there's a passage from Nehemiah too, like the forbidding of marrying foreign women. Same thing, right? So it's the same tool, different targeted communities. Similarly, you'll see similarities in the fear-mongering that gets weaponized around safety of our children and women, right? So we've had to keep our women and children safe from the Black men. And now we've got to keep our women and children safe from the trans women and the drag queens and whatever, right? So same underlying message that is, the Jim Crow laws and the laws banning drag shows or education around race, sexuality, gender, etc. There's similar tactics. They're just targeted at different groups. So part of it is like, okay, we see the similarity in tactics. The goals are similar: dehumanize, delegitimize, disempower. And so what are we going to do to like have a more integrated understanding, a more overlapping understanding of how we resist evil, injustice, and oppression? Because it says right there, oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. And friends, we have a lot of ways that it presents itself. And so what we want to do is sometimes it's helpful to zoom out and recognize how these different expressions of oppression are actually related and like feed off of each other. So there's actually a limit to how successful any single issue lens can be. So we want to like live into this idea that you've probably heard this, but the Jewish poet from the 19th century, Emma Lazarus, wrote, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." Right? And then you might also have heard something similar from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "No one is free until we are all free." And that's a recognition that really fundamentally these expressions of oppression are, all of them are anti-gospel. Like none of this is the good news. And that it's functioning to actively prevent the conditions for the flourishing of life for all people. So we want to be able to see this as work that we do in tandem, not separately or in silos, because we have been promised this spiritual, material, emotional salvation through God's grace and love, and we need to act like we need to put some real meat on that, how we love our neighbor, whoever our neighbor is, all of our neighbors. Okay. I am conscious of time, but just real quick, there's no shame. Okay. It's not a quiz. You're not being graded. But if you want to take just a second to type in the chat what you've heard about intersectionality. So either how you would define intersectionality or what you think it means. And like I said, it's not a quiz. I'm just trying to see what we know collectively. Okay. So yeah, so everyone's connected in some way, feelings of the feminist movement. It is the kingdom of heaven. Something like having more than one identity. Oh, you guys are like kicking in and I can't read fast enough. Yes, okay. Actually, Amanda, all of these are really good, but here, I'll just skip, I'll get us to the definition I'm going to use. So intersectional theory asserts that people are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression. Okay, so race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, all those other social identities we talked about. So intersectionality, the concept, recognizes that identity markers like women or Black don't exist independently of one another. They each inform the other and create a more complex convergence of oppression. So intersectionality, we have this like this power and privilege and all this, and it looks so pretty and it's like gradiated and whatever. But intersectionality, I mean, this can also look pretty, but the reality is like the ways that those identities give us access to power or not, the oppressive, like the overlap of oppression or lack of power is actually what Kimberly Crenshaw is trying to name. So she's trying to name that like the intersecting layers of different forms of oppression, that it's basically saying like these multiple marginalized identities are greater even than the sum of their parts. So it's not additive, it's something more multiplicative, or something creating something uniquely different. And the fact that intersectionality has become kind of a buzzword in public conversation kind of makes me laugh, because I like took a graduate class 25 years ago and like studied this, and it honest to God made my head hurt because it was so like deep. And now like you turn, open the newspaper and people are talking about intersectionality, and I'm like, I don't know. You know that line from the Princess Bride, like, I don't think that word means what you think it means. Anyway, so here we are, understanding that the ways that power relates to our multiple identities. So it's more about relationship to power than it is about having multiple identities. Does that make sense? I see. Okay, great. So just as an example, Black, trans, and gender nonconforming people face some of the highest levels of discrimination, even for all transgender people. So transgender people as a whole experience high degrees of discrimination and violence. Black transgender people even more so. So these next few slides are from a report from the National LGBTQ Task Force, and it shows that like anti-transgender bias coupled with structural racism means that people of color, particularly Black trans people, are experiencing devastating levels of discrimination. So unemployment, twice the rate of overall transgender sample and 4 times the rate of the general population. 41% of Black respondents said that they have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. That is more than 5 times the rate of the general US population. Black trans people live in extreme poverty. 34% reporting a household income of less than $10,000 per year. That's more than twice the rate for transgender people of all races, 4 times the general Black population, and 8 times the general US population. Black transgender people are affected by HIV in devastating numbers. More than 1/5 of respondents were living with HIV, compared to a rate of 2.64% for transgender respondents of all races. More than 1/5 of respondents are living with HIV. Hopefully this just gives you like a snapshot of how we want to be able to bring both a racial justice lens and a queer inclusion lens and queer justice lens to the work that we do, because the truth is, like, there are people whose identities are people of color and queer, right? So people aren't separating themselves, so we can't really separate all the issues. But also, like, recognizing, again, we are all people made in the image of God, all beloved people, all beloved children of God. And the system says otherwise. So we want to be able to approach the system to demand change, to influence change over time that has something that has more togetherness than it has separateness. So that us versus them mentality is not going to get us anywhere. So how is it that we are we in our work toward justice that is more, that is bigger than just our single issue lens? So recognizing the time, I've done a lot of talking, and I realized I was talking really fast too. So I hope that enough of it sunk in, but I'm going to ask you, I'm going to have Deb send you off into small groups in just a moment. And here are the questions. I think Kirkland was going to drop them in the chat also, so you have access to them when you go. But the first question is, in your conversation, in your small group, start to think about who is the most vulnerable in your community, whatever your community is. And think about how they're being targeted, right? What might be the consequences of indifference? And even think about how, like, the church might be colluding with that marginalization. And what relationships might you be cultivating, relationships of accountability, when you consider ministries in the community? That's several questions. These are from a GCORE study, and they're just meaty. And so you're only going to have 15 minutes, so I don't expect you to get through all of these. It's just to try to get you thinking, right? And then if you don't like those, you can look at the second set. We've already talked about this. It's really common to approach things from like a siloed or insular understanding of oppression. Like, this is my thing. I'm going to focus on racial justice. But we want to cultivate that intersectional like approach. So start thinking about what are some of the ways that you collectively might begin moving toward a more intersectional approach. Are there studies that you might do? Are there people that you might cultivate a relationship with? Are there sermon series you might ask your pastor, put your pastor on the spot. Actually, there's a bunch of pastors here, so I'll take that with a grain of salt because I don't want to get in trouble. So I'm going to say, we're going to send you off into small groups. You're going to have 15 minutes to talk. We will come back and be able to touch on those questions that you've submitted or will submit before we wrap up. And before we wrap up, I will give some like ideas of action items. So don't think that you're leaving here with just me blabbering. I hope that there will be something concrete that you can do from here. Any questions? But I was actually going to see if we wanted to do Q&A before I got to those.
Sure. Yeah. You want to do that?
Let's do that.
All right. So, Dana, one of the questions we received earlier, is what framework might you recommend using instead of or in addition to our United Methodist Church's baptismal vows when we talk to people who are not United Methodist or not Christian about a call to justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think you can frame the same kind of, you can build off of a similar framework around human dignity, that you're not going to use the like beloved child of God language so much, but like what we're trying to recognize is that these systems of oppression are like, they're built into all levels of our lives in the US. They're oftentimes not super like noticeable unless you're being, unless you're one of the people that's experiencing that oppression as a target. But that what we aim to do is to create the conditions for all life to flourish. And I do mean all life. So not just like people, but like all of creation is suffering from the same like oppressive systems that are all interrelated. And so how do we make that argument for all of creation to live and to flourish and to have access to what they need? And that requires addressing these systems of oppression in multiple, multifaceted ways.
There's almost like an intersectionality just in itself, right? Multifaceted, trying to pull in other things. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Find the connections. Okay, here's another question. This is maybe more of a data-oriented question, but do you have a sense of, or does someone else here have a sense of how many churches have a racial reconciliation statement in Minnesota?
Okay. I should know the answer to this. There are at least 5 that I can think of off the top of my head that have gone through the process and have a church-wide racial reconciling movement covenant. Centennial is one of those churches. Hamlin, help me out. Are there any Hamlin people on the call? Hamlin, I think, has one.
St. Anthony.
St. Anthony, Faith St. Anthony.
Did Minnetonka?
Minnetonka, that's it was like Minnetonka was like early adopter.
Yeah. Holy Trinity.
Say that again?
Holy Trinity in Prior Lake.
In Prior Lake. Oh, okay. Cool.
I don't know. I'm just asking.
They've done some work. I don't know if they've actually done the racial reconciling piece. And there's a couple others, but like a lot of churches have created racial justice teams in the last couple of 3 years. And so I know the Grove has been doing a lot of intentional work, and White Lake has been doing a lot of intentional work as well. And they've used some consultants like Richard Webb is a local consultant who's worked with the Grove.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I'm like pointing to a square on my screen that means nothing to anybody, but I'm hoping everyone recognized that I was asking her essentially. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So not everybody has done that, like the racial reconciling movement covenant, but a lot of more churches have been doing their own iteration of racial justice commitment and forming a team and working.
And so if people are interested in learning more about that process, is there a place they can go directly to find more about that, or should we connect with one of the churches you listed?
That is a great question. And that like iteration of programming may not be current. It may be on hiatus right now.
Sure. Great. Yeah. Okay.
But it is worth reaching out to the new director of racial justice and equity, Sabrina Tapia Contreras, who I don't know what, I mean, she's like 2 months into the job, so don't ask her too much, but she's really smart, but I don't know if she got all the things flowing in her work plan yet. But I do know that kind of congregational resource was part of that job description. So being in conversation with the annual conference for like what resources there are is definitely worth it. Worth making that contact. And then being in conversation with the churches that I listed off is also really, and maybe a more practical first step actually, because folks, you can kind of find teams that are in a similar life stage as far as development of the team and like their process, and just hear what people have done. So yes, and yes.
Well, thank you for sharing about that, and thank you for the work you've done with all those churches, I'm sure, too. And it's very gracious of you to share some more tonight about that. Another question that came in is, it kind of starts with a comment. Dismantling oppression is tricky if you think about it from the point of view of those we might recognize as the oppressor. So knowing that, in what ways are we oppressors? And then how do we dismantle oppression in ourselves?
Man, if I had like an answer for that and I could write a book, I'd be not worrying about finding a job right now. I mean, it's true, right? This is complicated stuff. There is not a program. There is not a like process that is like easy peasy, do the thing, and we fixed it all. I just also want to lift up like the roots of these systems of oppression go back to like the doctrine of discovery, right? So this is like centuries of parable theology and things that have like taken over. So we're not going to fix it in a couple of years, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't like be working on it with our whole selves. And it is, I think the part about the recognizing that we all carry different social identities, and each of those social identities gives us more or less access to power, is a really important first step in understanding how we as individuals may be part of the like oppressor kind of class, or maybe colluding with that oppression, right? So just like thinking through like, what is it in my own life that like gives me power or doesn't, and then being able to think about the dismantling in ourselves. Again, that's going to take a while, right? Like this is deep stuff. It's like socialized into us, conditioned into like in a like deep embodied way. So it's not something that you can like read a couple books and be like good to go. Books are great. Don't let anybody tell you that I don't like books. But it can't just be the books. It's got to be, this is, we've identified as a denomination that racism is sin, right? And that oppression is sin. I mean, we name it in our baptismal covenant, right? That we are like called to dismantle oppressive systems. That's also spiritual work. So it's not just like a social experiment that we just do. It's like deep spiritual soul work too. So like having a robust prayer life is part of our justice work. Having having community that helps call us in or call us out when we're like, kind of in the swirl of how we've been socialized into oppressive system and thought, having church that challenges us to like think about and enact and embody more just ways. And I think I will just lift up in particular, this is not work to do alone. Like today is the anniversary of John Wesley's death, if anybody's a Methodist nerd. And his final words on his deathbed were, "Best of all, God is with us." And that is what I like try to remember in all of this. Because like, if you read the newspaper, the world is like a hot mess. And like, all I see is like the ways oppression is like winning, right? But I can't just be stuck in this moment in time. I have to refill. I have to reconnect. I have to know that I'm not in it alone. I have community, and I have like the creator that helps call me forward and hold me up in this hard road. And honestly, that part about like self-identifying as part of the like as oppressor, that's tough work, but it's necessary work. So like people like find the ways that you can like sit in that discomfort and not let it shut you down. Because if every time, like, it's easy to get activated by being like identified as the oppressor, or the, even like language about privilege, right? That you feel like, oh, and in your body, you're feeling this tension and like energy, but like having some practices that help like bring you, like settle your nervous system, tell your nervous system everything's okay. Like, yeah, that's uncomfortable, but you're not being threatened right now. There are no tigers chasing you. You just need to like, resettle, reconnect, and know that like this is hard work. So don't go at it like with this. It's not all terrible though. Like, it's hard work, but it's not all terrible. This is joy-filled work. Like when we get to like dismantle the stuff that is that lives in us, that is part of oppressive systems, when we get to reconnect with our humanity and our belovedness, and then connect and see the belovedness and humanity of others, that is a joy-filled thing. So this work is like about grounding in God and knowing that like this work of connection is joyful and like life-giving. It's not just like, let me self-flagellate about all the things I've done wrong in my life and how I'm part of this horrible thing. Like, we have to recognize the bad stuff, but like we're striving for something like holy and holistic. So
Deanna,
yes.
This is Pamela. Would it be okay? There's an anti-racism workshop coming up this month by Catrice Jackson, and it's actually going to be held at Centennial United Methodist Church. And I would love to share that with folks, if that's okay.
Do you have a link that you could
Yep.
put in the chat? That'd be great.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do, is just the link. The link is for a number of workshops. The first one coming up in just a couple weeks. And there's also, for the first time, she's doing one for white men also.
Cool.
So I wanted to point that out. The other thing is, you were talking about that embodied practice is, Res Momenicum. There's nobody does that work like he does.
Yeah.
And so, and he's got workshops and books and all kinds of things. So,
and there's some like communities of practice that are starting connected with New City too. So I can pass along that information through, I can get it to Judy, maybe. I don't know. Whoever's in charge of sending follow-up notes after. I'll send it to a few people and see how it goes. I'm conscious of time, but I did want to just lift up. Actually, Kirkland, could you drop that GCore link again, just so it's more readily available. So actually the opening prayer that I used and those discussion questions come from a General Commission on Religion and Race discussion guide. They did a webinar on intersectionality, totally worth your time. And they have this really rich discussion guide with Bible study and more to go into, and then like great links that are embedded in that. So as a one-stop, like, what do I do next? That's where I would point you as far as learning more. I just want to lift up prayer requests for, there was a trans woman who was violently attacked at the light rail station in South Minneapolis on Monday morning. Broad daylight. This is the train station like closest to South High School, so like it's very, very like populous or like very well used light rail station. But she was attacked by multiple people and suffered, I think, a couple broken ribs and a punctured lung, and maybe possibly a brain injury. So if you could just pray for her, and there's the article that Kirkland just put, one of the articles about it. And then the other thing that I'll just leave you with is there are a couple pieces of legislation coming through the Minnesota state legislature right now that are worth like tracking and worth like speaking up around. So if you want to write to your representative and your state senator and let them know that you support these bills. So one is a ban on conversion therapy. If you haven't read about how harmful conversion therapy is, I highly recommend that you do a little bit of reading. But that is House File 16 and Senate File 23. And despite the name therapy, it is not therapeutic. So we want to make sure that ends. And the update is that it passed the House vote, and we're kind of anticipating a Senate vote soon. So, and then the second one is a trans refuge bill, House File 146 and Senate File 63. So this bill would actually make Minnesota a safe haven for transgender youth seeking healthcare. So if you've been tracking at all, there's at least there's close to 100 pieces of legislation across the country that target young people, young adults, and prevent folks from gaining affirming healthcare. And so this would make it so that people could travel to Minnesota for the healthcare that they need. It has passed the House Judiciary Committee and is waiting a second hearing in the Senate Committee. And those, and just as far as like kind of an intersectional lens, like the refuge bill is really important, and also recognize that like trans women of color, particularly Black trans women, are already under like experiencing terrible outcomes in healthcare anyway. And then if gender affirming healthcare is restricted in their state, like it's just layer upon layer of complication. It seems like, yes, we want to be welcoming and people can just come here, but like just coming here is not as easy as it sounds. And there's like racial and economic layers to that. So like just even thinking about what the use case could be and how we might be attentive to folks who might not just be able to like buy a plane ticket and be able to like think about supportive measures that are intersectional in nature. That's a great question about JRLC. I don't know. They've had some transition, and I haven't been paying as close attention to what their priorities are this this session. So it's worth looking into. But I don't know the answer off the top of my head. We're past time. So Kirkland, you had something you were going to share with folks?
Beyond that, first I want to just, Dana, thank you for your time with us and sharing all your wisdom. Everyone, can you join me in appreciating Dana? A sign of appreciation, or if you've got your camera off, maybe do those nice little hands that Zoom gives us. And again, thank you, Dana, so much. And thank you, all of you, for participating, registering, showing up. We're grateful. I'm going to drop one more link in the chat for you. That is just to find the Minnesota Reconciling Congregation's website. We want to invite you to our next event. It's going to be the Spring Social Gathering, Saturday, April 29th, from 11:30 to 2 Spirit of Hope UMC in Golden Valley. Going to include not just a gathering time, but also a potluck lunch and time with author and theologian Austin Hart, who is going to share his experience. And I apologize, I just mispronounced his name. He's going to share his experience about coming out as a transgender Christian from his childhood in a non-affirming church to his years in seminary, and now as an educator for faith communities worldwide. So that portion will be online if you're not able to join us in person. But again, Dana, thank you so much for your time here, and for all of you. We want to offer each of you a blessing and hope that you'll connect with us again soon. Dana, so if you have any closing words, it's all you. Otherwise, I think that's
sure.
it.
I'll make this short. So there's a favorite book I have is called The Church Cracked Open. It's by Reverend Stephanie Spellers, and she writes. Amanda seems to agree with me that this is a good book. She writes that solidarity is love crossing the borders drawn by fear and selfishness in order to enter into the situation of the other for the purpose of mutual relationship and struggle that heals us all and enacts God's dream of beloved community. And so as my parting words, I say to you that I pray that we all can stay rooted in our shared belovedness and continue to practice embodying solidarity across all the borders created by fear and creating intersections of grace and liberation. Blessings to you all.